I'm talking with Andrew Rubin, who's CEO of Illumio. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Andrew, there's quite a bit of buzz developing around Illumio thanks to some pretty good investment rounds. So I think people are anxious to hear just what Illumio does.
Sure. So Illumio was really started on a very simple premise, which is 80% of the investment that enterprise makes in their enterprise and data center infrastructure security is really only looking at 20% of the traffic that they need to protect nowadays. And if that math seems a little fuzzy, there's a simple reason why. Because 5 or 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. We had an operating model for security that followed the motion of our infrastructure and the applications that we run on it. And nowadays, most of what we're really trying to protect happens behind the firewall or behind the perimeter, or sometimes out of our buildings altogether in places like public cloud. And it felt like there was a decoupling of security from the thing that it was designed to protect over the last few years. We felt like there was a way to start with a clean page, a blank piece of paper, and build a software platform that allows security to truly mirror not just the architecture of infrastructure today, but also the way in which enterprise operates the infrastructure and the applications that they run on it.
Okay, so I'm an analyst and I need to put you in a bucket. Where do I put you?
Sure. So a lot of people talk about the problem of understanding, having visibility, and certainly being able to write rules around segmentation, segregation, enforcement inside of the data center. I think conveniently the term east-west came up a few years ago because we all understood that what goes in and out of the data center moves in one dimension, and now there's a new dimension that people wanted to start to think about, but it's actually much more fine-grained than simply east-west or lateral control. In a sense, these problems have been solved with things like firewalls being dragged inside of the data center, or sometimes you just use the network itself, and we use tools like subnets or zones or VLANs. The problem is that the complexity of managing these things at scale and also managing them in a very dynamic world where things are constantly changing, it's making the tool seem inappropriate for the job. So it's a tough thing to say that there's a defined bucket. The nice part for us is that the one audience that seems to be aware of the need viscerally is the customer. So they may not know exactly what to call it yet, but they understand that they have very real problems like PCI segmentation or lateral spread of attacks behind the firewall. So there may not be a name for the bucket, but there's certainly a very large set of use cases and a very well understood problem that the customer is expressing every day.
Give us an example of how you've deployed and what that deployment process was like. Somebody putting software on a virtual machine.
So let's talk a little bit about the architecture, because that's probably the starting point. We had a first principles assumption at the very beginning, which is that every enterprise is going to run in a very distributed and very heterogeneous way going forward, which means in our world, the way that we think about security is a customer is likely to be running on bare metal, VMs of multiple flavors, and even containers, of course, nowadays. And those assets are going to be placed everywhere from their own data center to potentially any public cloud provider that they can put them in. And security is supposed to be able to follow that motion no matter what it looks like or where it goes. Our architecture allows us to mirror the compute of the customer. The way in which we do it is we actually do put an agent into the compute instance, but we took a different approach. We all know that in the past, the agent architecture was really about a host-based firewall, and you effectively put an agent in to become a local firewall.
Right.
We realized that by doing that, there are certain taxes and certain costs that you end up paying, some of which in the past have gotten in the way of that technology becoming pervasive. We do have an agent, but our agent actually resides in the OS. We have a Linux and Windows flavor of it. It is agnostic, of course, to whether it's running on bare metal, a VM or container instance, and it certainly doesn't care about the data center or public cloud provider that that thing is sitting in. And that agent really serves a unique purpose. Instead of being a point of enforcement or being in line where some of that tax and overhead issue becomes real, what we do with our agent is, and the way to think about it is, it's actually an antenna. The agent really sits there only to do two things. It has a send function, which is a send of context and telemetry of that workload. Our agent is sitting there looking at things like the OS, the processes, certainly what the workload is talking to and what is trying to talk to it. And it's sending all that information to our policy compute engine, which I actually like to describe as the central brain that sits over the system. And in turn, the policy compute engine allows us to provision policy to that local workload. But when those policy instructions are received by the agent, they're not actually dealt with at the agent level. The agent actually writes a set of rules to either IP tables in Linux or WFP, the Windows equivalent. And that allows us to effectively wrap that workload with its own local layer 3, layer 4 firewall. And so we have a different approach with the agent, but it does solve two problems that are incredibly important. The first one is it truly allows us to deploy an agnostic footprint. We don't care about the platform. We don't care if it's bare metal, VM, or container, and we don't care where that asset resides. As a matter of fact, we have customers that have taken us and put us in a local or legacy data center while using us in public cloud providers at the same time. So it solves the architecture problem. But the other thing it does is the world, as we all know, is moving into more of a DevOps and very often an orchestrated or automated mindset. And security is very bad at that traditionally. It seems like security is the follow-on. The agent architecture allows us to bake ourselves into those motions so that if somebody's using orchestration to bring up new VMs inside of their environment, the agent can become part of that motion, so when the VM instantiates and comes to life, our agent is part of that build from the very beginning. So it's a very different approach.
Got it. So because of the telemetry you're getting from each one, can you then discover an instance that's not instrumented with your agent?
Absolutely. And so there really are 3 services that we deliver on top of the platform today. And last week we actually announced the first extension into a 4th one. But that first service is something called Illumination. And just as the name sort of leads to, illumination is not about enforcing or stopping or blocking. It's actually about discovering and visualizing. And so what we would do is we would have a picture of an environment, and that picture is as a result of those agents being deployed onto instances within it. Of course, if something tries to talk to one of those instances that does not have our agent on it, we would still see that communication coming in. Of course, we may not know where it's coming from because our agent is not yet deployed on it, but one of the common motions with a customer is they'll start with a group of instances, and then they'll watch to see what's talking to it, and that becomes the spider web effect of putting out more agents.
Cool. Are you finding customers for the first time reporting that they actually understand their network architecture now?
I'll tell you, Richard, there are actually 3 surprises in the 22 months that we spent in stealth when we were engaged with about 100 enterprises, but doing it very privately. The first one was there's actually a lot of bare metal left in the world. I think sometimes we forget that it takes a very long time for certain things to go away, and sometimes they don't go away at all. And so the first one was there's actually a lot of bare metal inside of the data center today. The second one was I was shocked by the amount of windows. I probably shouldn't have been. Yep. And of course, the running joke at Illumio now is that with the chairman of the board of Microsoft sitting on our board, he's reminded me every day that that shouldn't have been as big a surprise as it is. But the third one was actually the lack of understanding and very often the surprise at what's actually running behind the firewall. And what we found when we spoke to customers was there was a very real understanding that without visibility and understanding of the environment, it's really impossible to protect it. And so being able to draw the picture and visualize what all the workloads are, how they are talking to each other, and what they're participating in ended up becoming a very important part of the Illumio platform story.
Yeah, I'm sure discovering shadow IT resources, or back in the day when internet access was difficult to get, people used to hide their web servers inside the organization and serve up crazy games and such. You probably are discovering all of that.
We have, and actually one of my favorite use cases that came from a large enterprise that we're working with was when they described the fact that just simply finding orphan machines inside of their infrastructure. And of course, I thought about it as a security person about the effect of finding an orphan machine, something that nobody knows is there, and my mind immediately went to, well, what is it talking to? Their use case was actually if we could just shut them all off. Think about the money that we would save in power, resource, and overhead, because we have things sitting there serving no purpose to the organization, and yet we don't know where they are or what they're talking to, so how could we shut them down? Yeah. And it was an interesting use case because it really obviously had very little to do with security and a lot to just do with how do I operate at scale in a dynamic data center environment.
So, so the illumination was one part. What are the next phases?
So what we realized was there had to be a change in the way in which policy is written, and more importantly, actually, the way in which policy is distributed inside of an enterprise's data center and nowadays public cloud provider. And why I say that is because it turns out that policy is really 2 separate things. I think the industry as a whole has done a very good job of putting the description of policy together with the instrumentation of policy. And the way that I like to describe it is, if you think about how you describe policy for a simple 3-tier application, the actual implementation of policy is very different than the description. So let's start with a simple 3-tier application. And if I were to ask you, this application with a web tier, an app tier, and a database tier, what should the policy be for how those things interact with each other? I'd make the argument you could actually describe it with two very simple sentences. The web tier and the app tier need to be able to communicate with one another, and the app tier and the database need to be able to communicate with one another. And then I'll take it a radical step further, which is if we assume this is a whitelist model, then you could also say, I'm done after two statements, because I don't have to describe that nothing in dev can talk to this application in production. Inherently, I've defined the only two permissible relationships. The problem is that when we go to write the firewall rules, or we go to create the subnets and the zones and the VLANs to put these actual resources in, what we find is that, number one, the instrumentation becomes much more complicated than the expression. And number two, as that application and the resources it runs on changes state over time, we end up writing a lot of rules. And so we talk to customers that say things like, I have 500,000 firewall rules, but I didn't write them all in the last 2 weeks. I wrote them over the last 10 years. We ask them, well, some of those must be things that you could delete or get rid of. And of course, the answer is we never delete anything because we would have to understand what every one of them do and how they depend on each other. What Illumio does is it allows you to describe your policy in natural language. And it does it based on a set of labels and a set of relationships. So we take that 3-tier app and we actually label the 3 components that make up the application: the web tier, the app tier, and the database tier. And then we actually can give you other descriptives that allow you to describe it in a much more fine-grained way. So we add in things like, what environment is it running in? Is it the application running in dev, test, stage, or production? Or of course, if it's a compliance-oriented organization, it may be, is it running in a PCI-scoped environment versus the non-PCI-scoped environment? And then of course, because many of our customers are global, we add in yet another dimension: location. So as we all know, part of location is simply knowing where my things are sitting, but nowadays, a lot of it is driven by things like data residency, again, compliance-driven. And what we realized was if you could describe the things that you're running and the places that you run them, your security policy is really just describing the relationship that those things should have with one another. The challenge, of course, is that makes a lot of sense as a way to describe policy, but how do you instrument that into the infrastructure? And maybe more importantly, how do you ensure that it's always instrumented correctly when things are constantly changing? What Illumio built is a platform where one of the 2 software components is this piece that we refer to as the policy compute engine. And that engine is effectively the way in which we understand the infrastructure. That's where illumination comes from. All of that context and telemetry that we're constantly receiving allows us to build the picture of what all these workloads are, what they're participating in, and of course how they're talking to each other. And then from there, we move to the enforcement service. But our enforcement service allows you to write policy in natural language through labels and relationships. And then what our policy compute engine does is it figures out the exact set of whitelist rules for every workload that participates in that policy, and it computes and provisions those policies to every workload. The way I like to describe it is, you and I are sitting and having a conversation today, but there was some framework around our conversation. We knew that we were going to start at 8 o'clock and we're going to end at 9 o'clock. We knew that we were going to talk about Illumio as opposed to politics. And we certainly knew that we were going to speak in English to one another. If somebody else were to walk into this conversation in the middle and they didn't belong here and they tried to talk to one of us, in the Illumio model, we would simply not allow that to happen. It could never accidentally talk to you or talk to me. If I tried to start talking to you in French, you would simply say, I refuse to listen to it, let alone understand it, even if you understand French, because that wasn't the context of the policy set between us. And we not only provision these rules, but then what we do is, as the infrastructure changes over time, we continuously recompute and reprovision the rule. So the relationship always stays exactly the same. And back to my example of you and I, if you were to pick up and walk down the block and go sit in another hotel, we're still allowed to talk to each other until 9 a.m. in English, and we would still understand that. And of course, the other hotel in the real world is I'd be in the data center and you'd be in AWS. Does that make sense?
All that makes sense, but now what do I do with all those policies that I've already deployed in switches and firewalls that have my legacy policies now we're talking about?
Sure, and what we've really listened to our customers on is how we're going to interact and participate as part of the security landscape. What we're understanding is really 2 things. The first one is we solve a set of problems that the legacy infrastructure hasn't been able to successfully solve, or certainly solve efficiently in the past. And so I think that there's a lot of places that our customers are taking us today where they're looking at us as the right tool for the right job, and therefore we're a good fit and not necessarily a replacement. In some places, we're actually going in greenfield. Very often when somebody's building a greenfield environment or a greenfield application, we're the first security being brought to secure that environment or application from the very beginning. What we did, and the announcement we made last week with F5, I think is a good indication of how we're trying to participate with the ecosystem that's in existence. So let me talk for a moment about the F5 partnership and the F5 integration.
Good.
We had a number of customers that came to us and said that the Illumio value proposition is that behind that firewall, inside my data center, we have servers here and servers there. And of course, I say servers generically. It could be VMs and VMs. And these things are talking to each other. And Illumio allows me really to do three things. One, visualize that relationship. Two, describe the policy that enforces how those things communicate with each other. And there is a third service that I didn't mention a moment ago, which is called Secure Connect. So we have the ability to not only say that A can talk to B, but that A only can talk to B over IPsec. And because of our architecture, those IPsec tunnels can be built and maintained across any environment, across any platform. What the customers ended up saying to us in the last really 6 months since we launched was a lot of times there's actually this thing sitting in between server A and B, and that thing happens to be a load balancer. Now, F5 is obviously one of the most pervasive load balancers inside of enterprise data center, so it was a very logical place for us to think to start. But it was really the technology that was very easy to understand in terms of the value proposition. What our customers said to us was, if you see that server A is starting to act out of profile, it could be out of profile as in malicious, or it could be just out of profile as in it's accidentally doing something it shouldn't, and it's trying to talk to B, of course you can enforce the policy at B, but it would be much more efficient if you could enforce it at the load balancer sitting in between those two things. And so listening to our customers, we decided that there was probably a way for us to take the context and the telemetry that we understand and use it to program something besides a workload. And the F5 load balancer and of course the NGINX load balancer, which we announced as well, were the first two things that we did. The way that we look at that integration is that it says really three things. First, we want to participate in the ecosystem. We have no desire to obviously replace the investments that our customers have made. The second thing it says is that there is a way to take a customer's existing investment in something and make it more strategic and more valuable. We're actually giving the F5 load balancer a second job without introducing any new hardware, any new complexity, or any new overhead, and certainly any new cost. But the third piece is it's a statement about enforcement should be delivered at the most efficient point. And I think that's something that security is coming around to now, that enforcement is a multi-dimensional task. And finding the most efficient point for a particular piece of enforcement is important, but the policy model that sits on top has to understand everything in order to be able to do that.
When you start talking policy, I put my auditor's hat on because the first thing I do when I come in is I check all the policies and I check the change controls on policies. And it sounds like you're introducing something that's more granular and more complex in implementation, though not complex in designing and deploying. How do I check the change control process for these policies?
Absolutely. So, interesting story. When we were in stealth, and as I mentioned, we were in stealth, so we kept our story very private, but we were very engaged with about 100 enterprises that really served as our feedback loop and very often the validation loop. We were sitting showing a retailer at the time the platform. It was very early, but we were able to show them the policy model and we were able to show them how those rules get written to the workloads. And one of the things that they said was, but how will we ever be able to show our auditor that there's actually a trail of these policies being implemented? We can show them on screen what we've described, but all those list of IP addresses and how those things talk to each other doesn't exist. So we listened to that feedback, and what we did was we actually built an audit log into the platform that allows you to still write policy in this much more efficient and much more dynamic way, but underneath every single rule that gets provisioned, of course in IP language, to every workload is auditable, loggable, and of course reportable, which means that the same way that you would produce a firewall log, or you'd be able to show that this zone can talk to that zone and therefore it's in compliance, we actually give you that same audit trail and we give it to you in the same language that the auditor is used to seeing after all these years. Now, of course, the optimist in me says that over time, we're going to find a better, more efficient way to deliver those logs than just simply a string of IP addresses. But for right now, we have to exist in the world that is not the one that necessarily is the one we hope to see. And so we actually complied exactly with what the customer said, which is you need to give it to us in the language that we're used to dealing with.
So you're out of stealth and going to market, so you're going to be extremely busy just developing the business side, but what's next for the company?
I think there's three things that we've talked about, and when we announced the Series C round of $100 million last week, many of the interviews that I did, we talked about what's important for 2015. Certainly, there's also the question of where would we like to see the company go over the long term, but what do we need to do? And I think there's really three areas that you're going to see us invest in very heavily. The first one is we call it the Illumio Adaptive Security Platform, but it is a platform not because of the name that we put on it early on. It's a platform because the core value proposition in what we built is the policy engine and the ability to take the context and telemetry to build services on top. Illumination, enforcement, and secure connect were the first three. The F5 integration is yet another piece. And of course, we believe that there's more to come. So I think one area that you're going to see us invest in very heavily is actually R&D. Our customers are being vocal, at times aggressive, about what else they'd like to see participate inside of our platform, but it takes investment and it takes a serious focus on R&D to be able to deliver those things and yet have the entire thing scale at the same time. So I think one thing that you're going to see is you're going to see a significant investment in R&D and of course a platform expansion as a result. The second thing is exactly what we're doing here today. We have a story that is both new and also very different. And as a result of that, we have an obligation to not just let the market know we exist like any early stage company, but we actually have to take the time to explain what we've built, how we built it, and what the value proposition is attached to it. So here at RSA, we sort of have said that this is actually, in a lot of ways, the launch of Illumio. We launched the company on October 22nd of last year, but this is the first time that we've really made a very big push to let everybody know exactly who we are and what we do. And so I think the brand and the brand awareness, but also the story is going to be a big push for us. And of course, the third and final piece is we're going to significantly expand the field presence. Sure. We've been in market for about 6 months. We have coverage on the East Coast and West Coast of the United States, and we've begun to fill in the middle. But we just announced that we have our UK and Singapore offices opening, and we're in the beginnings of staffing both of them up right now. We've actually been engaged in both markets with customers all the way back to stealth mode, but now we're going to build a field presence in order to begin to build real territories.
Well, I can see, Andrew, that you're going to be very busy, and I look forward to catching up with you next time.
Thank you very, very much for having me.